Cool. Hello, everyone. Sorry for the brief delay. Okay, I'm going to talk about the Ethereumization of Bitcoin. Dun, 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 dun. No, or maybe it's good. Maybe there's some secret Ethereum fans here. Yeah. Huh? Oh, this way. Okay, we're going down. Okay, so I hope this is not, my intention is not for this to be a seat bait. I don't know if that's the term for clickbait, to get people into seats or controversial talk. I think it'll be fun. And yeah, I don't have all the answers. I sort of wanted it to be a discussion kind of, let's talk about these ideas. And I sort of have already been doing that, all of yesterday, talking about this stuff and showing people slides. And so we can talk about it more. It's sort of the last talk. I guess there's some stuff after this, but I don't really know when they kick us out, but we can hang out. I don't think I can go to the party because I have a plane at 9. But yeah, let's talk about this stuff. Also, I put a little Nostr thing because I'm going to try to use that because, I don't know, it seems cool. Okay, so some disclosures, disclaimers, financial whatever. I do have some Bitcoin. That's probably most of the people here. It would be a little weird if people were like, no, I've never touched Bitcoin. I have never had any Ethereum. I did work on Ethereum a bit in 2014. So I talked to Vitalik a bunch, and we were this was before they did their whole ICO, and then I stopped working on it. But I wrote some of the proof of work, hash function, stuff like that. And I am friends with people who work on Ethereum, and that's sort of how I got a lot of the data for talking about this. But I'm not shilling things, and I also don't want to trash it. The more I worked on this, I sort of was like, oh wow, this is really interesting. So table of contents, and I learned a lot of Ethereum terms. Learning about this. So L2 NGMI. NGMI stands for not going to make it, which is bad. And the converse is WAGMI, which is we're all going to make it, but I don't think we're all going to make it. And then the sort of second section is that the reasons Bitcoiners don't like Ethereum no longer apply. At least, and I don't want to generalize to Bitcoiners, but me and maybe other people here, I was certainly surprised. I'm like, oh, the reasons I didn't like it don't really count anymore. There may be other reasons not to like it, but it was kind of interesting. And then the 3 is sort of it could happen to you, right? This is sort of a warning. Okay, so first part is if you've been in this room or that room today, you have probably heard talks about layer 2s and rollups and ZK verifiers and opcat and covenants and all this stuff, right? This is the topic in Bitcoin now. I don't know, but one of the really big topics. And part of starting why I wanted to talk about this was just I don't work on Ethereum. I don't really know about it, but I'm like, okay, it feels like Ethereum's coming into Bitcoin because so many of these things are from Ethereum, and right, we never really had that before. We were talking about MEV, and that's an Ethereum term, and rollups and all these things. So it's where is this coming from? What's going on? Yeah, so it's sort of okay, let's learn about Ethereum. And L2s are sort of what were my starting point, because this is sort of, I guess, officially, there is an official Ethereum roadmap, and that's here's how we're going to scale. It wasn't always the case. First, I remember people in Ethereum, Vitalik being no, that's bad. Lightning's dumb. You need to scale L1, and we're going to do sharding, and there's going to be total transparent. And yeah, that sounds great. Total transparent scaling, where it's just yeah, it's one global state, and we sort of behind the scenes chop it up, and so each individual physical machine doesn't have to deal with it, but logically it's all in one thing. They got rid of that idea, and now they're sort of doing an L2-based scaling idea. Okay, so most of the L2 stuff in Bitcoin, actually having just seen the talk a few hours ago, maybe that's not really true, but a lot of the L2s, if not want new opcodes, right? You want a soft fork, you want opcat, you want some kind of verification stuff to make better L2 stuff. And so I was always thinking well, Ethereum's had any opcode you could ever possibly want, and they've had it since 2015, 16. And what did they build? And so you can find this site. It's called L2Beat, and it's actually pretty nice, and it sort of shows all the different Ethereum L2s and what they do and how their risks are. And it's got this nice, it's got a little bit of a CoinMarketCap, CoinGecko kind of vibe because it ranks them by how much money they have, not by how good they are, but it does sort of have a how good they are little pie chart. And yeah, so there's lots of TVL, another Ethereum term for total value locked, that is way more than the Lightning networks, which is a little depressing. I'm like, oh man, yeah, Lightning has, I don't know, millions of dollars, 500 Bitcoin, something like that. But they've got like, billion, $10 billion, whatever, which is, of course, mostly, well, not mostly, but a big chunk of it is their own coins. So you make an L2, you got to make a token. And yeah, what about the whole decentralized trustless verification thing? And so they class it as like 5 risk types. And so here's the risk for base, which is, some people say the largest, some people say the second largest, but it's like increasing, and it seems to be becoming the dominant L2 in Ethereum, and it's run by Coinbase, the company. And so they have this like exit window, data availability, state validation, sequencer failure, proposer failure. I, in my mind, translate this into Lightning Network when I see these, and so I'm like, data availability is like, yeah, if you lose your channel state, like you're kind of screwed, and there's ways to get around that with, like LND has static channel backups, and there's all these, and like exit window I sort of think of as a force close, but these are not perfect translations, but that's just because like I'm very familiar with Lightning, and so I sort of translate out into those things. And maybe some people here are also more familiar with Lightning than like Ethereum L2s, so maybe that's helpful. So yeah, if you are familiar with LN, think of exit window as like your time for a force close, and your like state validation is kind of the justice transaction where you can, if there's an error and someone broadcasts the wrong state in a channel, you can say, nope, that's wrong. And well, in Lightning anyway, take all the money. I think in all of the L2s, they don't really have that kind of punishment mechanism because that doesn't really scale to multiple users. They instead have a just sort of correction mechanism, the way L2, ELTOO/LN symmetry does in Bitcoin. But you'll notice here, they're just none, right? In the largest thing with, $10 billion of people's money, it's just like, yeah, we haven't done that. And for me, I was like very surprised because that feels like releasing Lightning Network software with just no ability to force close. And it's just like, well, what else is there? That's all the work there is in Lightning is you're just exchanging commitment transactions, which you can use to force close. And then there's a whole justice transaction thing, which like basically never happens, but that's still like 30% of the code. So it just seems very different ethos than like working on Lightning. And the Coinbase rollup is not unique. You can look at this sort of ranking. They kind of all have little red. One of the most common red chunks is this one, which is exit window. And that's because it seems that most or almost all of them have this sort of like backup smart contract failure where like if something goes wrong, the people in control of this rollup or this L2 can sort of fix the bug. But of course that can be exploited where if they turn evil, they can fix the bug by like, imagine like a big tap tree, and then there's like a little leaf at the bottom that's like, actually, here's this 2 of 3 multisig. And like, we do all this complicated validation, but like, if 2 of 3 sign, like, we can just move all the money. And that sort of, I guess in the Ethereum world, seen as like, yeah, this is a temporary thing. We don't know if these things really work. They're still bugs, and we have this just to deal with bugs. But at the same time, it's like, well, yeah, but you have this to deal with a bug, but really it's still there, and like if those keys are compromised, then they move all the money. Yeah, and also the really interesting part is a lot of stablecoin usage. And so I actually have, I don't know if this is a secret, but I've talked to people who know about Base and know about Circle, and they do USDC, which is like a big stablecoin. And apparently, and this is a rumor, whatever, I'm propagating a rumor, the USDC that exists on Base, then like Coinbase sort of gets a cut of the float, right? Because that's how that's how all these stablecoins make money. They have like, what, Fed funds rate is like 4.5% now or something. So you got like $20 billion, and you're like, hey, I get a free $1 billion a year from just like the float on the interest that I'm not paying out to the users. But then like Coinbase is like, hey, this is our L2. So you've got your stable coin, but like we want to cut. We want half of the float or whatever it is. So they're getting money that way. But it's also interesting that there's like bridges, and bridge used to mean, well, I thought it was like a cross-chain atomic swap or some kind of trustless thing. But I think the word is completely just means custodian, right? It's just you send your stable coins to an address, and that address holds it, and then they make another sort of stable coin on the L2. So you've got custody of your custodial stable coin. Yes. So yeah, the trustlessness is not there yet. But what's interesting is like you look at all the Ethereum people talking about it, and like I feel a lot like more, I don't want to say kinship, but I'm like, oh, I agree with all these people. Like I'm reading all these people working on this stuff, and they're like, oh, this is a mess, this is a problem. And I'm like, yeah, it is. So like I sort of agree. So it's not trustless. They sort of feel like Blockstream's liquid sidechain is what I'm familiar with. And in fact, it's very much like it, because I remember, about 10 years ago when Blockstream first started, their first paper was, the sidechains paper, and then a big part of it with this symmetric two-way peg. And it wasn't really talking about federated. It's like we need to make a sort of SPV level way that we can sort of peg in and peg out without trusting a set of signers. And at least as, hasn't really happened in Liquid, and it's still sort of an area of research. Okay. And to be fair, I don't want to like dunk on L2 development in Bitcoin, because it might just be better in Bitcoin, right? And I think that's a totally fair thing to say, where it's like, yeah, it's kind of a mess in Ethereum, and they're doing it in a way that like feels very centralized and custodial, and seemingly that everyone's okay with that, or at least the users are. But maybe Bitcoin's just better, and like we don't do those things. And an example would be like, there's Lightning Network, and I think it works pretty well. And then there's also like this Raiden network in Ethereum, and it sort of like never really took off. And it might just be that like, the people working on Bitcoin have a sort of more of a like, no, we really need this like decentralization and trustlessness stuff. So maybe, right? But at the same time, it might also be harder to do a lot of this stuff in Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin's really limited in terms of like what you can do with opcodes and UTXOs and stuff. And talking to people, the L2s in Ethereum, you're still using the same software. So I talked to someone who works on Reth, and a big part of his project working on Reth, which is the Rust Ethereum node, is getting Reth to run in the L2s and then getting it to run in an L3. So the idea is like you're using the same exact software and code base, whether to run Ethereum's like regular blockchain itself, or whether to run an L2. And I actually tried for this talk, I tried to IBD in Ethereum. I didn't quite get there. You need a more, at my house I have a lot of computers and junk. I don't have an SSD that's more than a terabyte. I got a bunch of hard drives, I got a bunch of SSDs. I need to buy like a 2 or 4 terabyte SSD, because you can't, as far as I can tell, sync Ethereum with only a terabyte SSD and a bunch of hard drives. Also, there's 2 binaries. It's like, imagine if Bitcoin had like 1 binary to validate the headers, the 80 bytes proof of work, and then another binary to validate all the transactions in the block. And then you have to go to plug them together with RPC, and you kind of have to try. It's a weird experience. I tried to get it to run, couldn't quite get it to run, but still learned a bunch, and learned that they were, it's an interesting thing where they're like using the node as the L2 software itself and L3. So you have like an L2 within an L2, and then there's like another bridge to go from your stable coin to your stable coin on your L2 to your stable coin on your L3. And then, okay, so that's one part. It's challenging, but like hopefully some of this won't apply to Bitcoin. But then the other part, like looking at all this, I was like, wait, the reason people don't like Bitcoin might not really apply, reason Bitcoin people don't like Ethereum might not really apply anymore. I would say Bitcoin and Ethereum don't really work together. They don't really get along. And like, why not, right? We're sort of working on similar things. Well, it's an altcoin, and so Bitcoin people don't like altcoins, pretty much by definition, right? But there's altcoins and there's altcoins, right? Like, I don't know about everyone, but there's certain coins that are just like, no way. You don't talk to people, like, come on. And then there's people like, they're working on the like Mimblewimble stuff, like Beam, and you're like, oh, cool, how do you do that? And, like, or you're people working on like Zcash or Monero, and you're like, that's cool, like, you know, like, so I think there's definitely like a spectrum of altcoinery where, I don't think I'm alone in like, there's some altcoins that are like, hey, that's kind of cool research, and like, you know, these are interesting things. Could we use some of that in Bitcoin? Maybe not, I don't know. And I feel like Ethereum at this point might be a little bit more like, hey, they're doing difficult, but maybe some interesting things, so it's not that bad. And then just looking at it, like, the aesthetic is different, but don't trust verify. They're like, they have a whole site, you know, page, run a node. Like, here's how to run a node, here's where to get the software, here's like encouraging people saying, no, you really should verify everything and run a node. I'm like, yeah, no, that's, this, you could copy and paste this and put it on Bitcoin, and it's like the same thing. So it's just like very interesting to me that like the ethos and the goals seem so similar, and yet the direction is so different, right? Where, and so I think the biggest example is like proof of stake. I don't think there's any legit, like, Bitcoin's not changing to proof of stake. No one ever talks about, like, yeah, it's not even a thing. But in Ethereum, they're like, no, we're going to do proof of stake, and a huge reason is because of decentralization. We think miner centralization is a problem, and so if we make it proof of stake, people can sort of run these staking nodes, the equivalent of miners, on their home computers, and that sort of re-decentralizes mining. And that's like such a, like, I was like, I had no idea that's why they were thinking about this. Like, that's so interesting. So it's weird, right? It's like, wait, these is this why I didn't like Ethereum? I don't know. So other reasons we don't like Ethereum, or like I was like, no, it's centralized, right? It's pre-mined. You just sold it all. I remember asking Vitalik at 20 Mission in San Francisco when he was doing the crowd sales, like, can you guys buy your own crowd sale? And he's like, yeah, of course. I'm like, but you get it for free because it goes at the other end of you. And they were fine with that. I don't know. But yeah, it's, you know, they did this hard fork to get their money back. You know, these are like serious, like, yeah, this is much more centralized. We could never do this in Bitcoin, even if we wanted. But these are legit points. I don't think they're really true anymore, because all these things about Ethereum being in control, you know, Vitalik, Ethereum Foundation being in control of Ethereum, they've been losing control of Ethereum. And they sort of have like lost control of it, which is really interesting to me. So this is a diagram of like, what's a slot? I don't know. Everything's got a different name. There's builders, and there's a proposer is just a miner, I think. A builder is like, anyway, they're all like, in Bitcoin, you just mine, right? It's like pretty straightforward. Although, no, people were talking about like, hey, let's have mining separate from block construction and stuff. So like, it's happening here too. But basically, in Ethereum, you don't really have a mempool anymore. And so yeah, it's a problem. So there's like 2 APIs that take up 90-something% of all transactions. Like, so there's not Flashbots. It's Beaver Builder and Titan Builder are the 2 big ones. Beaver Builder is the bigger one. I don't know. I mean, maybe some people know who runs these things, but they're not really like open, free companies. It's like, here's this like API at an HTTPS endpoint, and that's where you send your transaction, and that's what everyone does. And there kind of isn't. So like blue down here, vanilla, I guess, is like the regular peer-to-peer mempool, and it's just gone. And they're like, well, we should get rid of it. This was not intentional. This was not, so you like read and talk to Ethereum people, they didn't want this. They were like, oh shoot, we don't have a mempool. Like that, what are we doing? Like this is, so it is interesting that like, and I remember, this is several years ago, like I think it sort of started with Flashbots and this MEV stuff, where people who were mining at that time, actual mining on GPUs, would make vastly more money by running Flashbot software than running the default Geth. And so it's like, sort of overnight, it's like, wait, that, like, they didn't really care. They're like, oh, you're using this MEV. And that's what was interesting in Ethereum. They sort of embrace it. They're like, it's called MEV. It's just a thing. Like, that's how miners make money. Totally fine. But I was like, wait, no one's running your software anymore. Like, and I know, like, with Bitcoin Core, a lot of people are working on, like, hey, we want miners to run this. We want, we want this to be the best block builder. We want this to, like, maximize fees for miners, because if we don't, they're going to run some other software, and then you sort of lose control of that. And that's sort of what happened in Ethereum, which is really interesting. Also with L2s, a lot of people in Ethereum are like, wait, everyone's making L2s now. And there's like Uniswap, which is one of the big drivers of both MEV and transaction fees in Ethereum. And the Uniswap's like, yeah, we're just gonna make our own L2. And that way we capture all the fees instead of paying it to the stakers or miners or builders or whatever you call them. And people are like, wait, this is bad. If it's just all L2s, no one's gonna really use this. And then of course, when the other thing in Ethereum that I think happens a lot is people want to make tokens because that's how you get rich. And people got rich making the Ethereum token, and then you had people sort of splinter off, and it's like, well, I'm going to make my own token. So you had like Polkadot or Cardano, or people who were working on Ethereum was like, well, I can make my own token instead of like working for this guy. And so similarly, it's like, well, let me make a new L2, and I can make a token in it, and I'll get rich. So it's really interesting to me that like the foundation and sort of the open source developers of Ethereum seem to be sort of losing their grip on Ethereum. And the Bitcoin people were like, that grip is sort of bad. But is it because like Bitcoin Core is very much like we want the miners and users to all run Bitcoin Core? And so it's sort of an interesting thing where it's not really becoming decentralized, but it's not becoming controlled by the same entities. And it's sort of becoming like privatized in a way. So tangential, this is what, like, it feels like Bitcoin aesthetic is like, you see Guy Fawkes masks and black hoodies and stuff. And the Ethereum aesthetic is literally, pastels, pastels, unicorns, and rainbows, right? But the actual way these things work is sort of the opposite. Like, Bitcoin's kind of more hippies, and we're all like getting along and stuff. I don't know, like TABConf, like like TABConf is like pretty chill, and like I pay the $121 in Bitcoin to get here, and I'm like, yeah, because I know like Mike Tidwell's not getting rich off TABConf or anything. Like we're all just like hanging out. But haven't been to ETH Denver. I don't know, does it cost more money? But like in Ethereum, like everything's like, no, we got a token. We're like making money. Like everyone's out for themselves making money on these things, and so it's like really an interesting thing where it's like feels the opposite of what I thought it would be. Anyway. Okay, so oh wow, I don't have too much time. Oops, I went too fast. Okay, but part 3, so we can do some questions. Although questions, like if people ask me questions about Ethereum, I'll be like, I think. So I don't really know how it works. But part 3 is like, this could happen here. And this isn't like a news flash. Like people have sort of been talking about this at this conference for a while, about like MEV, about all these things. But just as an example, like if you remember CryptoKitties back in like 2018, I remember sort of laughing at Ethereum, especially because like they were saying like, oh, transaction fee of a few dollars is ridiculous. These systems should have 5-cent transaction fees. And you're like, okay, well, how are you going to do that? And then they have $100 transaction fees because everyone's trading these like JPEG cats or whatever. And we're sort of like, haha. And then remember how people would say, not super informed people, but like, CoinDesk or something would be like, oh, well, you can do this in Ethereum because it's Turing complete. And we're like, yeah, it's Turing complete. That's why you could do CryptoKitties in Ethereum. And so you totally needed Turing completeness and rich expressivity for NFTs and meme coins. And then, and this kind of thing. So I don't really know why I guess it's just Casey was just like, oh, let's do this. And like no one else did it. I don't know, is that all it was? Because for years, like 3 or 4 or whatever years, it was just like, no one did this. Everyone did it on Ethereum. All the NFTs were there. And then, ordinals, all these things happen in Bitcoin. So of course you could do CryptoKitties on Bitcoin if you wanted. It wouldn't be that hard. So then it happened. So yeah, of course you can do this. Why did it happen first on Ethereum? I don't think it's because it was easier. I think like ordinal inscriptions are actually pretty straightforward. They're really easy. I think you can put much bigger JPEGs and stuff in Bitcoin inscriptions than in Ethereum. Because Ethereum, like they chop it up finer, like, the blocks as they are smaller, but there's like every 12 seconds or something. So in Bitcoin, you can kind of do this easier. I think it might have just been culture, where like in Ethereum, it's like, yeah, this is cool. Like make NFTs. NFTs are a thing. We have companies, OpenSea. We have all these, this is a thing we're cool with. Whereas in Bitcoin, some people clearly a lot of people liked the ordinals and the inscriptions and BRC20, but a lot of the developers don't, right? So a few weeks ago, I was at a Tokyo conference, and Casey was supposed to be there and give a talk about ordinals, which I was like really looking forward to. And then he got sick, which sucks. And then they put Luke Jr. on instead of Casey to give a talk about ordinals. I was like, what? And I'm like, okay, you went from the guy who like came up with this and made it and probably likes it to some extent, to the guy who hates it like the most of anyone. So, but yeah, I think there is, as far as I know, there's no like Luke Jr. of Ethereum. I think people are generally like much more cool with like whatever, right? Like, yeah, you're doing this cool thing. That's sort of what Ethereum's for. It's for, you've got this space, you've got this gas, like go for it, do something crazy. So it might just be culture, I don't know. So yeah, so both Bitcoin and Ethereum have lots of these problems. And the Ethereum problems, I will say, seem harder for now, so far, right? Like, so I sort of have, looked at it and it's like things I worry about and things I don't worry about, and like totally people could have different ideas. The things that seem most concerning, that's like, yeah, this could totally happen, is like a lot of the MEV stuff. It's like, yeah, this seems almost inevitable, right? I don't even want to say it, but like, yeah, there's no DEX for runes, but like, I can think of ways to do that, right? I'm not gonna like talk about them because someone might actually do it, but like they're gonna figure it out, right? Like it's not that hard. Yeah, like sort of automated marketplace. It's definitely harder in Bitcoin because you don't have just like Solidity and you can like just write a program to do it. But there's probably ways. And like rise of custodial L2s, also like, I don't know, maybe that doesn't happen in Bitcoin to the extent, and people are much more like, no, I want this to have an exit window, and I want this to have unilateral exit. I'm not gonna put all my money in a Coinbase run 2 of 3 multisig L2 the way people in Ethereum don't care. And that may be the case just because like there's not a ton of stablecoin usage in Bitcoin. You totally could. The first stable, it was a Mastercoin or OmniLayer or whatever that stuff was a million years ago. That started in, Tether started in Bitcoin, and then they dropped it because everyone uses it over on other chains. So I don't know, maybe that's not as bad, but it seems like some of this MEV stuff definitely can happen in Bitcoin. Medium term, I didn't really talk about MetaMask, but I think MetaMask is another big difference where I don't really know, no one really knows who runs what software in Bitcoin, right? Like there's no analytics in Bitcoin Core to like go tell Fanquake how many people are running Core, right? Like we don't put that stuff in there. But probably most people don't run Bitcoin Core and don't run a full node. Maybe some people run Electrum. A lot of people probably just use custodial stuff or like phone-based things where like they have their own key, but they don't really do any validation. There's like a big mix. In Ethereum ecosystem, like MetaMask is huge. MetaMask, everything is like using MetaMask. Like majority of users is like, okay, you got this web plugin, you got your seed phrase, and everything plugs into Infura, which is sort of this API backend, sort of like Explorer or Block Explorer kind of thing. But that's like the standard. And so it is interesting to see that like Ethereum Foundation people are like, hey, run a node. Like, you guys should do this. And it's sort of like too late because everything's running off of MetaMask. That is something of a worry I have in Bitcoin. Like people don't really run nodes. So that's why I'm still working on UTXO and stuff. And then the things I don't worry about, like a lot of these issues are because of proof of stake. And that I don't worry about, right? Bitcoin, I don't think anyone's like, oh, we need to change Bitcoin to proof of stake. Like, it's just not gonna happen. And also the like 12 seconds thing, where it's like, yeah, like that creates enormous, like that just makes it so much harder to deal with. Whereas in Bitcoin, you got 600 seconds, and so you're just like much easier in terms of like making things decentralized that way. So some of these are sort of self-inflicted on Ethereum. We're like, yeah, we're going to proof of stake, we're going 12 seconds. It's like, geez, okay, and then they have a bunch of problems from it. So anyway, that's sort of my ranking of like, these things could happen here. Maybe some of them won't, so that's good. Okay, so, wait, I went the wrong direction. Okay, Okay, so yeah, so sort of conclusion slides. I don't know. I kind of like Ethereum more after like learning about it, or not like, but I'm sort of like almost rooting for them. And it's also like, can we work together? Probably not. I don't know. It feels like it's just such a big gap, right? Like I don't know. Like the last time, okay, so I was at SBC in like 2020, right before COVID. And I just talked to Ethereum people the whole time, and they were working on stateless client stuff, and I'm working on Utrix, so they're the exact same thing, right? Like, it's like, how do we use cryptographic accumulators to not keep the whole state of our system? And it was kind of cool talking to them, like, oh, what do you guys do for this? And but then at the end of the day, like, we're going home, and we're just like, okay, bye. And like, we didn't exchange contact info. It was just like, it's like, well, we don't really work together, right? We're on different sides. And so, okay, see ya. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if we're ever gonna like have a, like, oh, let's like work together to solve all these interesting problems that overlap. Maybe not, but can we at least learn from each other's things we're doing and mistakes and like things? I hope so, right? And so I think, in Bitcoin, we can sort of like look at what's going on there, and we are a bit. And I think in Ethereum, maybe they're starting to like look at more, okay, what is Bitcoin doing? What works there? I know in both cases it was like, it's more than it used to be, right? Like in Ethereum, it's a great example, like their addresses. They fork, Bitcoin already exists. You could have used, well, it's pre-BEC32, but there was like base 58 check encoding, works great. And they're like, no, we don't need that. So they just use raw hex. And they're like, shoot, we need because their idea was like, we're not going to have cryptographic arbitrary identifiers. It's all going to be Ethereum naming service. So everyone's going to have names. That didn't quite happen. It's all addresses. And so then they had to like retrofit a checksum into the capitalization of the A through F characters in the hexadecimal. So a lot of stuff doesn't support it. It's like, it's a mess, right? And it's like, well, you should have just kept, the Bitcoin stuff. And, so in both cases, there's a lot of like, hopefully we're not recreating the problems that they have learned from. So yeah, I learned a lot making these slides. I hope people learned something from this. I don't know to what extent, like I didn't really know anything about what was going on in Ethereum. I started this because I looked at espresso systems, which I know some of the people, like Benedict Boons, who wrote Bulletproofs. He's working there now. And I looked at their website and I was like, I have no idea what any of these words mean. Like, what are they doing? Like, so I was like, okay, I need to learn some of this stuff. But yeah, I'm sort of rooting for them in that, like, I think if Ethereum like does okay and they like fix these problems and get everything to work, then I'll feel like so much better about Bitcoin. Because it just seems like, yeah, we have a like easier time. We're dealing with like an easier set of challenges in some ways than Ethereum. And so if they can like do okay, then like I think we'll do okay. So that's sort of the like happy, kumbaya hippie thing to say. So that's where I'll end it. I guess I have a few minutes for questions or like comments, so we can pass the mic around. So
big round of applause here. All right. Yeah, so we've got about 15 minutes for questions. Raise your hand, we'll bring you the mic to you.
Hey, Raj, did you get a chance to compare the custody solutions from Ethereum and in Bitcoin? And they have a richer expressive set, and now there's some fight for governance. So supposedly they should have a better story for it, right?
So I looked at that. So I will say, like, I know people who worked at BitGo, like, James and Lop and people, and they're like, yeah, it actually is like kind of way harder to do multisig in Ethereum. Because, in Bitcoin, you just have opcheck multisig, and now we are starting to have, musig and frost and things like that. But yeah, in Ethereum, it was like you got to write a smart contract for it. So it was actually not as easy. And it's definitely doable. But yeah, and then everyone probably knows the like big problem with Ethereum multisig was like the parity multisig, where they lost all the money, and then they were like, hey, let's hard fork to get the money back. And they're like, no. And it's like, well, you did last year for your money. And then the guy leaves and makes his own coin. So yeah, I think in theory, you can have like very powerful solutions. I don't know. I think it's not as straightforward though. And so it does end up being, in a lot of these L2s, it's multi-sig, right? Like they have these sort of set of, I forget what they call it, security council is the term they use. And they're like, okay, well, these people like only sign, and there is a multi-sig sort of option, and they sign if something goes wrong. So I don't know of any, and there may be, because like there's so many things going on. So there may be like really interesting, like better kind of threshold signatures and stuff that you could do. I don't know what's going on. So all the stuff I saw was basically just multi-sig in Solidity. So,
Yeah, a comment on that. So one of the big problems was that you can't send to smart contracts from some of the standard wallets in Ethereum. So a lot of wallets started using pretty fresh cryptography in MPC in order to have single sig, which under the hood was multi-sig, because you literally just couldn't send. So I was at BitGo, I didn't work on Ethereum, but we had to basically have a single sig address that would receive stuff and then forward it to our smart contract to a 3 multisig in order to receive to a 3 multisig from most wallets, which, yeah,
and so
it's
you have
hard.
that little window of like, okay, it's single key for a little while. Yeah, so it's, I mean, it's just so different. Like you don't have multiple inputs of a transaction. So you can't, like, yeah, it's a very different system. So.
I was wondering the risk or fear of, or actually, I just learned over the course of this conference about ETH basically not having a mempool anymore. That's really crazy. And there are, well, actually, I was wondering if you could talk about any concerns you might have of that happening in Bitcoin. I know, like, especially in terms of, we've seen this a lot with like just policy, right? And then as there's more protocols that people want to start developing on Bitcoin, if you want to avoid the policy, and then you just start sending directly. And there was a lot of concerns with like, with mempool.space, and they have these accelerators. And so what's your level of concern there? Where do you see like opportunities for hope, where there could be room for improvement?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, those are two good, like mempool, that's, accelerator, where it's like, oh, I want to RBF, but I can't RBF or something. Like those are similar, right? They're a bit, they're much less scary in that, but yeah, standardness, like, so I think, I know people I've argued with about standardness. I'm sort of like, we shouldn't have these standardness things in Bitcoin Core Relay, or like really weaken them, because it's okay as long as no one does it. But when you start having, where was this? Like, well, this is miner only, right? If the miner is just like, okay, I take a whole block to make a logo that like really only shows up on mempool.space, but whatever. But yeah, that probably cost them a good amount of money. Anyway, but like wanting to put a big NFT, and it's like I have to go directly to a miner, does feel scary, because now it's like, okay, I have to bypass the mempool. Like this won't get relayed. I have to talk directly to a miner. And so there were specific miners who were like, yeah, give me your, more than 400 kilobyte inscription. I will, put it in. As long as that's like pretty rare, it's okay. So you have like this trade-off where it's like, okay, the devs don't want this thing, and so we're gonna like make it non-standard. But then if everyone still wants it, like they're gonna be able to get it. And then that leads to is people are like, all right, I'm not gonna run your software. I'm gonna run a different software. I'm gonna run a fork of Bitcoin Core that doesn't have this, this standardness, which on its own feels like, yeah, that's no big deal, right? If you actually did see that, where people were like, oh, I've got this fork, I changed the line, and there's no standardness for transaction size, so it'll just relay anything, and everyone starts running that, then I bet a bunch of the people working on Bitcoin Core would be like, okay, fine, we'll change that line too, right? So that we're back in sort of, well, they sort of will give up, right? What? What? Huh? I'm just saying. Okay, well, that's a good question. If people did this, would you be like, okay, fine, forget it?
Do you know why the maximum standard size exists?
I mean, you don't want to like
because it's not
DDoS
because
people.
devs personally don't like big transactions. It's
I know
because you can have a worst case non-sequit quadratic sig hashing transaction that takes like 30 minutes to validate. That's like chain ending. Like that's horrible. Like it's not there because devs don't want big transactions. Like
in the mempool.
I agree with you that like the standardness rules that are not there for DOS protection. Sorry, I'm like being really hostile. I apologize. Thank you so much for the thank you, Taj, for the great presentation. I really liked it.
No. I mean, I agree, but it's not consensus, right? If someone wants that transaction, if Mara decided to be a jerk instead of making a logo in their block to make a half-hour validation transaction, they could do it.
Yeah,
right?
but I disagree with the premise that like standardist rules are arbitrary like dev wishes on that they impose on chain, right? They're there so that like your node functions properly, so that your node can participate in transaction relay and without needing like a huge amount of compute or memory or something.
Right.
Like it's for decentralization. It's because we want everyone to be able to participate in the transaction relay process.
What I would say is devs want decentralization more than, say, these people do, right? And so like there is there is a set of people who would totally be like, oh, cool, we can run a weird fork that doesn't do this, and now we can do this easier. And like, yeah, and they'll be like, yeah, I'll buy a, computer with like 128 gigs of RAM or something. Like that, yeah, and we don't like, but that's the hard part. Like we don't want to encourage, like I don't want that either. But at some point, if it's like everyone wants it, then you're like, like how do we navigate this? So I don't have a good answer either, but like, this seems like the same problem that has led to no mempool in Ethereum, where they're like, okay, we have this, we don't want people to do this, and then they sort of get around the client, and so that because then everyone will just stop running if everything people want to do can't be supported by the decentralized peer-to-peer mempool, that's a huge problem. So, yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
I had another comment. I think it's quite an interesting thing that they have like these billions of dollars to invest in cryptography research, and they come up with all kinds of interesting things and all kinds of new, like they sparked this Cambrian explosion of proof systems, for example, and
or like I like BLS. People were talking about BLS in Bitcoin a bunch of years ago, and now no one talks about like, wait, can we talk about that instead of just opcat and stuff? I don't know, like BLS is really cool, and they're using it because like it was sort of like, oh, no one's using it, but like Ethereum's using it like all the time and doing the non-interactive aggregation and stuff. So it's like, yeah, I think it's pretty cool to see all the stuff that's coming out of it. So yeah.
But I think also a very interesting point is that even though they have that much of advanced cryptography that is obviously more advanced than what we have in Bitcoin, they didn't come up with like a system that is like 100 times better than Bitcoin.
Yeah.
That's quite an interesting point, I feel.
I think, yeah.
Bitcoin is already so close to optimal that you cannot
I also think
it that much more.
Yeah, and I would say like Bitcoin is very efficient. If you think of like all the developers, like, I don't know, if everyone's here is working on Bitcoin, I hope you guys are making a good amount of money, but I don't think we're making altcoin level money. But we're making everyone, Bitcoin's worth the most. So it's like, in terms of like capital efficiency of developer salaries, I think Bitcoin is definitely number one. So.
Hey, Tej. To clarify, I think the point about the mempool, that chart that you were showing wasn't necessarily showing a bunch of different private mempools, but rather who is actually building most of the blocks.
Yeah.
And those builders are getting their transactions from the mempool. They have some private order flow too, but a lot of transactions are just like going into the public mempool, and then builders pick them out and then actually build the block, which they pass on to the validators who get consensus on it. So I just wanted to,
I thought, because it like. Okay, I don't know to what, like, yeah. I've seen, from talking to people, like, there are a lot of API usage where it's just like submit. And from talking to people who worked on Ethereum, they're saying, yeah, the reason people submit directly is there's sort of this, like, you trust them. It's like they're not going to front run you or whatever. But if they see it in the mempool, it's like all bets are off. They can do whatever MEV stuff they want. But if you submit to them directly, they'll like be nice to you. Is the explanation I heard.
There is some of that for sure.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify that there is that, but that's not what this chart is necessarily showing.
Okay.
And I work for a company that is building a Bitcoin rollup, and I just wanted to mention, like, at least we are certainly reading the literature that's coming out of the Ethereum community and reading the research to learn from what's happening with Ethereum rollups, L2 development, MEV. We're trying to stay on top of what's happening there just because they are further ahead, and we can actually see how that's working at least in that environment, kind of at scale. But also thinking about how could this be different in the Bitcoin context. So yeah, I think there is some cross-pollination of learnings already happening there.
Awesome. Yeah, cool. And I hope we don't launch with to do for all the unilateral exit stuff. So.
Okay, this will be our last question.
Okay.
Yeah, Tej, I was wondering if you could elaborate more. To me, I think the concern about MEV in Bitcoin doesn't fundamentally address the primitives of how it happens in Ethereum. From my perspective, we can posit that MEV happens because there's insufficient transaction binding. Hence, you have to be concerned about the privacy of your transaction, else it can be front run. And the fees that you're paying that it's associated to that is exogenous. You can't tell directly from the transaction what's going to happen. And in Bitcoin, we do have that property where endogically I know these are the inputs, these are the outputs. And so to me, concerns about MEV have always felt like I want to create a scare scenario and nebulate around the fact that we don't have these problems because we bind properly.
I hope we don't. So I think an example would be like we were talking about discrete log contracts and the oracles. Like I don't worry about MEV in discrete log contracts because the oracle can't see the transaction. So it's like, hey, great, we solved that, right? Like we don't have to worry about that. Whereas in Ethereum, like the oracle's putting on chain, and so it's like, oh, if I order, so I have this transaction first, and then the oracle, like consensus-wise, then I get. So I do think it's exogenous in that, like, yeah, if you're just moving Bitcoin around, who cares? But we've got all this client-side validation stuff now. We've got a ton of, like, I don't know what the ratio is, but I feel like last year, probably most of the fees paid were not really Bitcoin things. They were like BRC20, and then now there's runes and stuff. And so once you have that kind of thing, it does feel like there could be MEV where miners are trying to get more runes or BRC20 coins or something. Like that, I hope not. And it feels a lot safer because, like, yeah, we have 10 minutes instead of 12 seconds, and we don't have a lot of these automated market maker things. So, like, yeah, right now there's basically nothing, but I'm just not as confident because, like, like I was saying, it like feels like we don't have to worry about a lot of stuff, but like I could imagine some of these things happening in Bitcoin, and hopefully we don't, and hopefully we can find ways to like not have these things. So, but I hope you're right. I just worry about everything. That's sort of my job. Yeah.
I just want to empty a whole bucket of salt here for a moment. Who would be really upset if we soft forked in a 20 KVB transaction size limit?
20 KVB. Oh yeah, I don't care, man.
Okay.
I guess lightning people because like you want to have an HTLC maximum HTLCs in flight or something.
I saw very few hands, but exactly the ones I expected.
Yeah, that would be one thing.
I think that this is kind of like speaks to the interplay between what Gloria was saying and Tej, that, we have used standardness and policy to achieve certain, DOS bounds or resource consumption things. And I think that we should say, hey, is it necessary for us to soft fork to eliminate some of those things? I think that can thread the needle between, listen, open access to the mempool is one of the most critical things in the censorship resistance of block production. As soon as you are a miner and you have to go beg some group to say, please let me in on your transaction flow, all bets are lost in terms of censorship resistance. And so we should definitely have that conversation to ensure the long survival of Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, soft fork to make 400 VB, and then in line with standardness. And, but
All
okay, I think we're
right,
done.
big round of
Okay,
applause.
thanks everyone.